Good evening. My name is Angela Bermudez, and on behalf of the Center for Ethics and Culture, I welcome you to the first installment of the Fall 2013 Catholic Literature Series. Every fall since 2002, the Center for Ethics and Culture has sponsored this event, featuring 4 lectures focused on literature in light of the Catholic tradition. The series sprang from the Center's desire to expose the Notre Dame community to the richness of the Catholic literary heritage. The Center for Ethics and Culture hopes to examine the role literature plays in our society and provoke thoughtful reflection within the university community. For this year's Catholic Literature Series, we chose to focus on children's literature. Though most undergraduates probably grew up reading or hearing children's literature, few have explored the unique ways in which it captures imagination and innocence. This series will discuss individual works of children's literature and explore the significance of children's literature in our society. Please mark your calendars for next Tuesday, September 17th, when John O'Callaghan, professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, will join us to continue the discussion of children's literature by focusing on the popular Harry Potter series. If you are interested in learning more about these events, make sure to write your name and email on the sheet that is going around the room. Tonight's lecturer is Daniel McInerny, who is the founder and CEO of Children Tub Entertainment, a web-based children's entertainment company featuring his humorous children's adventure stories. As a critic of the arts, entertainment, industry, and culture, his writing can be found on his popular blog, High Concepts. He also writes for academic journals, predominantly on issues in the philosophy of art and culture. After receiving his PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in 1994, Daniel McInerny taught for many years at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. From 2000 to 2002, he chaired that institution's program in the Center for Thomistic Studies. From 2003 to 2009, he served as an associate director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. And from 2009 to 2011, he served on the faculty of the Great Text program at Baylor University. His monograph, The Difficult Good on Moral Conflict and Human Happiness, appeared from Fordham University Press in 2006. Today, he will discuss children's literature in the Golden World. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Daniel McInerny.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you. If at any point during the talk you need to make reference to the periodic table, it's just there on the right. There's a couple key points in the argument where you might want to take a look at that. I begin with a confession. For many years of my life, and perhaps especially when I was the age of the students in this room, I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in children's literature, and especially children's fiction, which is going to be my principal focus tonight. And this includes when I was a child, at least when I was in the high summer of my reading years, say from 7 or 8 years old to 12 years old. When you think I would have been immersed in all sorts of children's fiction, I really didn't have the greatest interest in it. I was much more interested in nonfiction. In fact, I remember my mother later telling me how much of a challenge she found it to keep me in biography and history. Instead of fiction, I was reading the history of the Chicago Cubs. I had a taste for tragedy. Or the biography of Walt Disney was one of my favorite books. My mother said that I always asked her for books that were real, that I always wanted to read about something that was real. And I'm not quite sure what I was thinking at the time, of course, but I suppose I thought that children's fiction was kind of baby stuff, and I wanted the real stuff. So it was only as an adult, influenced in large part, but not exclusively, by having children of my own, reading to them, and eventually making up my own stories for them, that I really began to appreciate the genre of children's fiction. It wasn't that for much of my life I was too old to appreciate children's fiction. In a sense, I wasn't old enough. I didn't possess the maturity and the wisdom one needs to comprehend how good children's fiction takes us not away from reality, but to reality. Tonight, I want to talk with you about this power of children's fiction to take us to reality, and why children's fiction should be an integral part of anybody's literary enjoyment, not just children. And finally, why a Catholic understanding of the genre gives us the best perspective on its richness. But to do this, I must begin with a story. So, once upon a time, there was a poet who was climbing up a very high mountain. And he climbed round and round the path up that mountain, enduring many, many trials, undergoing many hardships. But when he finally made it to the top of the mountain, he encountered the most beautiful garden he had ever seen, with flowers that smelled as sweet as anything that he had ever smelled before. And by a stream, he saw a beautiful woman, and her name was Matilda. And Matilda told him that this garden was an earnest of eternal peace. And she told the poet that the garden was, in fact, the Garden of Eden, the terrestrial paradise, and that the poet, in fact, had just completed in his climb up the mountain a moral transformation that allowed him, perhaps for the first time since Adam and Eve were exiled from it, to enter into the garden. I'm referring here to Dante, if you read Dante's Purgatorio. I'm referring to Canto 28, if you're keeping score, when Dante meets Matilda in the terrestrial paradise. After Matilda explains to Dante the nature of this garden, knowing that he's a poet, she tells him one more thing that is most apropos for our discussion tonight. She says, by the way, the poets in their melodies of old may have dreamed on Parnassus of this spot, singing about the happy age of gold. For here the human race was innocent, forever spring, and fruit upon the vine. This is the nectar which the poets meant. Right? In the classical period, it was a convention for poets to create myths, as Matilda says, about a happy age of gold, right? About a bucolic land where everything is sweetness and light. And Matilda is saying that those poets, they're pagan poets writing long before Christianity, though they didn't know it, they were dreaming of Eden. They were dreaming of the terrestrial paradise, right? Unwittingly. I've argued elsewhere in talking about Tolkien that fairy stories, understood as Tolkien understands that term, can be like the poems of old, can be conceived as dreams of Eden. Right? But I also think, the more that I've thought about it, that applies to all good literature in the comic mode. And by comic, I mean that in the classical sense. All literature that kind of ends with resolution, reconciliation, love, marriage, right? That all literature in that vein kind of fits into that description as a dream of Eden, including our topic here tonight, children's fiction. To understand it in the context of Matilda's remarks, I think is the best place to get started. Children's literature as a dream of the terrestrial paradise. And it's because of this that I think children's literature has an essential connection to a Catholic understanding of moral formation, even if many, if not most, of the practitioners of it aren't Catholic at all. The very genre itself is a dream of Eden. Another way of putting my point is this. Writing may be a little small. But the thesis I want to put to you is that children's literature is about the adventure into the golden world in which innocence is fought for and achieved. If I had to define children's literature, that's how I do it. And what I want to do tonight is simply unpack that sentence for you. And I want to try to define more specifically what I mean by children's literature, what I mean by the golden world, and finally, what I mean by innocence. And when that work is done, hopefully, that thesis will be persuasive to you. So let's begin with children's literature. What do I mean by that? In order to define it, I need to say some things about its history. And I want to begin with a 2008 book by a professor of humanities at Stanford named Seth Lehrer, who wrote a book, Children's Literature, A Reader's History from Aesop to Harry Potter. And the very first sentence of Lehrer's book is this: ever since there were children, there has been children's literature. And that's got to be true in some sense, but I think it's also a little ambiguous, a little misleading. Children's literature as we know it today didn't really begin to emerge until, well, at least in earnest, until the 19th century. If we begin with Aesop, right, if we think back to the classical world, think of Aesop's fables, we might be first inclined to think, well, that's children's literature. But they weren't written specifically, much less exclusively for children. I mean, everybody read Aesop's fables in the ancient world. Surely they were adapted for kids, but they weren't written specifically as children's literature. We learn from Plato's Republic, if you know that work, that Homer, the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were a staple of education in classical Athens. Right? That was the children's literature of the day, but we don't tend to think of Homer as children's literature, though there are adaptions of Homer now for kids, but we tend to think of that as sort of highbrow scholarly stuff, things that you do maybe in high school, college. Think of Shakespeare's childhood. We don't have any direct evidence of Shakespeare's elementary education, but we have some indirect evidence in that we know what the curriculum was of the Stratford Grammar School. And it was a pretty rigorous curriculum compared to ours, certainly. Shakespeare spent his days reading Latin playwrights, Plautus, Terence, and composing imitations of them once he had the basics of Latin down. And again, we think of that as pretty highbrow stuff. We don't think of that as children's literature, but that's what children were exposed to at the time. Again, I'm not denying that throughout the classical and the medieval worlds there were folk tales, perhaps especially tailored for children. And I'm certainly not denying that fathers have been telling bedtime stories ever since man dragged himself out of the primordial ooze. I mean, that stuff has been going on. But the era of childhood was not picked out and made special until much later, as I'm going to argue, until the 19th century. So what do we think of when we think of children's lit? What are the associations that come to your mind? If you're like me, you think of the children's section at Barnes & Noble with the Winnie the Pooh 100-acre wood background to it, right? Or you think of the children's section at the public library, which is often one of the largest, if not the largest, sections in the library. We think of the books that we read as children, probably none of which is older than, say, I don't know, 150, 175 years old, right? Whatever children's literature is, it's somewhere in that group of associations. In any event, it's a fairly recent vintage. Things were stirring a little bit before the 19th century. Right? In the late 17th century, a Frenchman, Charles Perrault, wrote the tales we know as Mother Goose. Right? But interestingly again, those tales were not written specifically for children. They were written for courtiers in the court of Louis XIV. Seth Lehrer, who I mentioned a moment ago, writes this: the Mother Goose tales, or rhymes, appeared as literary texts during the age of Louis XIV, not so much as children's stories, but as exemplary fables for the courtier adults. They taught ideal behavior. They became the fashion of aristocratic salons. They contributed to the mythology of courtliness and kingship, and only much later became to be thought of as children's tales. Throughout the late 17th, early 18th century, again, things began to stir. John Newbery in 1744 published a book called Newbery's Pretty Pocket Book, which the philosophers in the room might be interested to know in its foreword pays tribute to John Locke, because Locke's educational theory was thought to be amenable to an understanding of children's literature that was not just about moral instruction, but could also involve reading for delight. And that was a big concern of John Newbery. You may know of John Newbery's name because his name appears on the Newbery Medal. And many of the children's books you check out of the public library or did as a child would have that medal, that kind of seal on the cover of the book, the Newbery Medal. Oddly enough, that's an American award, even though Newbery was British. And of course, in the early 19th century, we have children's and household tales published by the Brothers Grimm, and then Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales in 1835. Right? So it was in the Victorian era, late 1830s to about 1900, and then the Edwardian era, the reign of Edward VII, first decade or so of the 20th century, that we really have the first full flowering of what we think of as children's literature. And in many ways, we're still running on that steam. What are some of the books, famous books published in that time? We have Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense in 1846, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland in 1865. On this side of the water, Louisa May Alcott, we were talking about at dinner, Little Women in 1869. And then a favorite of mine, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island in 1883. And then in the very opening years of the 20th century, we get a work of drama first. Wasn't originally a novel. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan appeared as a play in 1902. Kenneth Grahame's classic The Wind in the Willows in 1908. The Secret Garden, 1911. And then the one Catholic author in my list, Hilaire Belloc, published a book of marvelous nonsense poetry, Cautionary Tales, in 1907. So this was a very rich time for children's literature. But here's a question. Why did children's literature emerge as a specific genre in this period? Right? What was going on in this time such that, oops, I had a slide. That's not. What was going on at the time that focused writers on the era of childhood, such that they wrote works specifically for them? Mara Gubar, who's a professor of kind of the history of childhood at the University of Pittsburgh, notes that it's kind of ironic that children's literature began to flourish in this period because it was not always a very child-friendly age. It was the age of industrialization during the Victorian period, and many, many children, especially in England, were working. Right? Child labor was rampant, and education reform was very sluggish. Yet there was education reform going on throughout the 19th century. In 1851, 1/3 of English children received no education at all. But by the end of the century, 90% were going to school for at least 7 or 8 years. And that had a big impact. Also, this was the era of the rise of commercial publishing, which helped publishing of books for all ages. But perhaps most importantly, in this period, childhood itself came to be seen more and more as a protected period of education and enjoyment. Childhood became romanticized. Lewis Carroll, in one of his letters, enthuses about children, saying this: "Their innocent unconsciousness is very beautiful and gives one a feeling of reverence as at the presence of something sacred." So why the sense, though, of childhood as sacred? Where did that come from? Well, keep in mind that the first 50 years of the 19th century, the beginning of the Victorian era, was the peak of Romanticism, the literary, artistic, cultural movement that reacted against the Enlightenment ideal of scientific rationality, embodied most of all in the Industrial Revolution. Romanticism was a response to the dehumanizing aspects of modernity. Or, as the philosopher Roger Scruton has put it, Romanticism was an attempt to recapture, in a secular mode, the medieval Christian sense of local community and reverence for God. This romantic desire for reverence was exercised in one direction toward non-human nature, but in another direction toward the child. This treasuring of childhood gave an increasingly secular culture a way of connecting to purity and innocence, to wonder, and to other worlds. It encouraged it to favor the imagination as opposed to reason in its scientific mode. Brad Berzer, a professor at Hillsdale College, argues in his book, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth, that for Tolkien, fairy stories provide us with a means to escape the drabness, conformity, and mechanization of modernity. And I think the same could be said for the children's literature that first sprung up in the Romantic period. Indeed, I would argue that the romantic sense of childhood and the children's literature that flowed from it was one way of trying to recreate the golden world of the terrestrial paradise. For this reason, though children's literature is largely secular in inspiration, the fact that its deepest inclinations yearn for a terrestrial paradise puts it in an interesting relationship to the Catholic literary mind. The Catholic can deeply appreciate much of what good children's literature is trying to do, even while it resists making idols out of childhood innocence and the child's imagination. Since World War II, the economics of children's literature have taken off, and the marketing demographics have solidified. So the parents in the audience will well know that there are children's books that begin with the board books and the plastic books that can even go into the bathtub that are usually more gummed than read. And from there you go into the beautiful picture books that we often see at the bookstore in the library, then to early chapter books like the Magic Treehouse series that my own kids loved and devoured. From there you get into the middle grade genre, the genre that I write in, and some people even want to divide that up into early middle grade and late middle grade, such that Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory might be early middle grade, say for an 8, 9, 10-year-old, and maybe the mid to late books in the Harry Potter series would be later middle grade, if not young adult. And then you have the young adult genre itself that could begin anywhere from 13, though I think myself that's a little young, but into the teenage years, into the late teenage years. But a phenomenon we were talking about at dinner is it seems a lot of college students, 20-somethings, maybe even 30-somethings, are still enjoying, maybe enjoying more than ever, young adult literature. So all those marketing demographics are now very solidly part of our landscape. What's interesting now about the current period is the digital technologies are changing the face of publishing even more, and they're impacting children's literature in some interesting ways. We now have a whole plethora of reading apps, right, that kind of make games out of reading and turn it into a more visual, if not oral, experience. This is one of the more interesting that I've seen. This is the Fabulous Flying Books of Morris Lesmore, which was not only a picture book and an app, it was also a short film that won an Oscar a few years ago. And it was produced by a studio in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, of all places, Moonbot Studios. You can get the app at the App Store for about $4.99. And it's beautiful digital animation. It's a charming story, and I think it's one of the best things, at least for younger readers, that you see in this new digital era. Speaking of Harry Potter, we also have the online experience that J.K. Rowling produced and that appeared first in the summer, or I guess it was fall of 2011, Pottermore. So that those fans of the Harry Potter books can go to the site and they can, get their own wizarding name, join a house, play in wizarding games, compete, for house points and all that stuff. All of this encouraging the reader to immerse himself or herself more and more into the world of the story. I think that's the main thing that the digital technology environments are promising, this kind of total immersive experience. And in my own modest, very modest way, I've tried to learn from these efforts with the website of my own series in not just sort of having a place where people can buy books, but having a place where kids can find stuff about the series that they don't find in the books and immerse themselves. So the characters in My Patria books have their own blogs. There are audio and textual short stories on the site that are kind of prequels and ancillary stories to the main stories. Again, trying to create more of that world. Now, this can also be a danger, of course, because this can become a sort of addiction for kids. But I think within moderation, it adds something kind of interesting to the experience. Okay. Children's literature, for all that, right? We've been distinguishing its rise to the fore since the 19th century. But for all that, I think it's a mistake to think that it is essentially different from adult literature. Right? It's really of a piece. It's really of the same kind. The narratives of moral transformation that we find in children's literature are essentially the same as what we find in adult literature. Right? That doesn't mean that the child is ready to read every adult book, right? It doesn't work that way. But in a literary sense, it's the same phenomenon. And this explains why I think that in the classical and medieval periods, the first inclination was for kids just to read what adults read, right? Because they need the same literary nourishment. And I think it also explains the enduring appeal of children's literature to adults. Right? But this doesn't mean, of course, that there's no difference between children's literature and adult literature. What are those differences? Well, there's a big difference in psychological complexity, for one. Not to say that there isn't psychological complexity in children's novels. But even a Harry Potter book is not Henry James, right? The examination of character and thought is simply at a different level in most adult literature of any real value. Also, in children's literature, the kinds of evil that are encountered are not going to be quite the same. Typically, you're not going to find a tragic ending in a children's book. I mean, a really hard Oedipus Rex tragic ending. That's going to be rare. And the evil that's depicted is typically not going to be as intense. Take The Hobbit, for example. You have a marauding dragon who's incinerating lots of people. There's real evil there, and Tolkien wants us to know that, but the portrayal of evil is not as intense as it might be, or even as it is in The Lord of the Rings, for example. Tolkien gives us a little bit of distance, for example, by having his Smaug talk, right, and being kind of this urbane dragon. Kind of softens the blow of the evil a little bit and adds some comedy. Another obvious difference is linguistic complexity. Right? We see this very obviously, say, in The Cat in the Hat, which has only 236 distinct words in it. Right? That's something that you find at least in young children's literature. And then finally, although in both children's and adult literatures there's a portrayal of what I'm going to be calling the golden world, in children's literature that portrayal is usually more fantastical. It's heightened, right? And that's what I want to talk about now, the golden world. I've said that children's literature is an adventure into the golden world in which innocence is fought for and achieved. And I've tried to say some things about what we mean by children's literature, and now I want to talk about the golden world. What do I mean by this? Right? Well, it's very much, if not identical, to what the literary critic Northrop Frye called Shakespeare's green world, which we see operating in a play like As You Like It, when the main characters of the play are exiled from the city. They go out into the forest of Arden. It's a place of peril, but it's also a place where the comedy takes place. Enemies are reconciled. Identities are switched. Romances are forged. It is where the comedy really is made, right, in that place of exile in the green world. The golden world, as I'm calling it following Dante's Matilda, operates in a similar way. It represents the triumph of death over wasteland. So let's think of some examples. They'll come readily to hand, I think. If you think of, this is Frances Hodgins Burnett's The Secret Garden. That's Mary Lennox for the first time turning the key into the secret garden in that wonderful story. But we also see the golden world in play when Harry Potter first goes through platform 9 3/4, right, at King's Cross Station in London. We see it in Wonderland and in Neverland, in Oz, in the dream world where the wild things are, the magical London of Mary Poppins, the 100-Acre Wood, the pastoral world of The Wind in the Willows and the Redwall series, in Terabithia, in the barn of Charlotte's Web, and the house with green gables on Prince Edward Island. But we also find the golden world on Treasure Island and in Camp Green Lake of Louis Sachar's Holes, or in the mysterious Benedict Society of the books by that name by Trenton Lee Stewart. By these last examples, I want to underscore that these golden worlds are not perfect images of Eden, even though that's where they're ultimately tending. They're filled with conflict, with danger, with evil. But I still call them golden worlds because it's in those worlds that characters undertake the work of restoring innocence. Innocence is not something that's just given to the characters in the golden world. It's something they have to earn. It's something that they have to fight for. Let's take, as a prime example, Frances Hodgins Burnett's The Secret Garden, written in 1911. Right? The basic story. Mary Lennox is a beast of a child, right? For reasons we don't need to go into. Her parents die, and she's shipped off to an uncle in England. And at this kind of country house, she kind of finds her childhood again. And it's through principally the discovery of this secret garden. It's been locked up. It's been locked up for some time, but through the assistance of a little robin redbreast, she finds the key. And she unlocks the door. And the garden is completely untended. You know, the weeds have been just let to grow for years. But she and her friend Diggin begin to restore the garden. And another part of the plot I'll just summarize quickly is there's another young boy in the house who turns out to be Mary's cousin who's been locked up in a room. People believe he has been handicapped, but he's not been handicapped at all. And he kind of achieves kind of a reawakening as Mary discovers him and she brings him into the world of restoring the magic garden. So the main themes of the work are, again, this rediscovery of natural beauty, very romantic, but also the children rediscovering their own innocence, right? Friendship, family reconciliation. All of these things are typical of golden worlds of all sorts. To paraphrase Matilda, it's a story of how to get back to the garden. And you could describe Harry Potter in the same way. In The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, to switch examples, the golden world is in one sense the Shire. I mean, that's what you might think of. Well, it's Hobbiton in the Shire. That's most obviously the green world. And that's true. It's kind of sort of the exemplar of it, perhaps. But really, it's the whole of Middle-earth that needs to be restored to its innocence and that we see restored, at least for a time, at the end of The Lord of the Rings. So then all of Middle-earth is restored to justice, it's restored to peace, and it's all a sort of garden, right, by the end of that tale. Now, one objection to all this is that all that I'm saying only applies to fantasy literature, literature in which the narrative takes us into a secondary world, as Tolkien would call it. But this is not what I mean at all, because the golden world, as I've described it, is also found in children's books such as The Revolutionary Boston of Johnny Tremain, or the Connecticut colony of Elizabeth George Spears' The Witch of Blackbird Pond, or the medieval England of Avi's wonderful novel that I remember listening to with my kids on tape years ago when we listened to tape, Avi's Crispin, The Cross of Lead. Right? So these are historical places, right? But the adventures that the child protagonists undertake in those stories can also, I think, be fairly described as golden worlds. So it doesn't have to be a fantasy secondary world. The story can be rooted in this world. Okay, so we've talked about the nature of children's literature. I've said a few words about the golden world. Now I want to talk a bit about what I mean by innocence. And I have a drawing up there by Tolkien's own hand of the lonely mountain that features in The Hobbit. Tolkien was a wonderful draftsman, if you've never seen his own drawings. And you can't quite see it there, but to the right of the mountain is the dragon Smaug himself flying around the lonely mountain. And I choose this image to underscore this point, that innocence is not primarily what the children of the story bring into the tale. Again, it's what they achieve. It's what they earn. Right? It's a moral achievement. It's not a given. Right? Someone might object on hearing me talk about children's literature as being concerned with innocence, as saying, yeah, but then you're talking about children's literature as keeping kids innocent in a negative sense. That is, keeping them in a bubble, keeping them sheltered from the world, making sure they don't encounter bad stuff in books. Again, that's not quite what I mean at all. I mean innocence as an exercise of virtue. I mean it as the opposite of being sheltered, as a venturing out into the world of danger, conflict, and even death, right? And finding one's virtuous way through it. I'm thinking of what Bilbo says to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. Captures the point well. He says, it's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no way of knowing where you might be swept off to, right? You might be swept off into many, many hardships, but if you face them well, you will attain the kind of innocence I'm talking about, this state of moral character, which is reached, like Dante's, at the end of a long and arduous journey. This understanding of innocence is becoming increasingly threatened by the contemporary children's publishing establishment. And I was delighted to see that a little later in this series, the center is going to host Megan Cox-Gurdon, who's the children's book reviewer for the Wall Street Journal, who has come under some fire in recent years for her views on young adult literature, the literature pitched at teenagers and above, for being morally pernicious. And it was amazing to see kind of the fire that she came under. I would really recommend to you kind of Gurdon's sort of definitive articulation of her views that you can find in a publication of Hillsdale College, Imprimis. And it might be the latest one. She has an article there called The Case for Good Taste in Children's Books. But if you Google her name, Megan Cox-Gurdon, G-U-R-D-O-N, you're sure to find pretty quickly her original pieces in the Wall Street Journal. There were 2 pieces in the Wall Street Journal in which she was developing her view, responding to her critics. Those are also good to read. So Gurdon takes on the YA demographic, the young adult demographic, and really shows how it's become morally corrupt. She focuses on what she calls young adult problem novels, and she has a whole list of specific books in her piece. But these are books that deal with explicit sex, all kinds of physical and emotional abuse, including self-abuse. They're very dark, disturbing kind of tales. And Gurdon as I'm sure she'll do here, but I'll just preview because it's such a juicy argument, says that the problem with these books is that even though they are written with the thought that, well, we're just telling about the real world that teenagers today are live in, they're kind of ratifying that world. They're making it normal in a way that's quite dangerous. This is how she puts it. The argument in favor of such books is that they validate the real and terrible experiences of teenagers who have been abused, addicted, or raped, among other things. The problem is that the very act of dealing with these pathologies, not just in one book, but many, tends to normalize them, right? And Gurdon doesn't even really focus in on young adult paranormal romances, which are some of the most disturbing of all. I mean, I know you've passed by the stacks at Barnes & Noble, past the young adult section, seen the rows of black sort of vampire books, all right? It's sort of how the genre is defined now. But the young adult genre is not the only subgenre in which conventional moral norms are being turned upside down. I mean, it was back in 1989 that a picture book was published, Heather Has Two Mommies, and we have continued to see in the picture book industry and in the middle grade demographic as well, kind of a turning upside down of moral norms. So there is a lot going on throughout the subgenres of children's literature that we need to be suspicious of. A Catholic appreciation of children's literature must stand athwart these current trends, certainly. In order to make our tradition's voice heard more vigorously, there's a desperate need, I think, for three things. First of all, a greater sense of children's literature as an occasion for moral formation, right? We're not just giving kids books to read that are just mere entertainment and have no connection whatsoever to the moral life, right? Doesn't mean that the books have to be heavily didactic, right? But even Mary Poppins, right, has a moral point. And we have to be conscious of that, both as readers and as parents. Secondly, parents need to be more vigilant and outspoken about books that are unworthy of our children, speaking perhaps most loudly with their credit cards, that is, by their purchases. Right? But they also have to be knowledgeable about all the good books that are out there, and there are many good books, too many to list, in all the genres I've been talking about. All that good information needs to be shared as well. Finally, what we need, and I say this to all the aspiring writers out there, is we need more Catholic children's authors in all these genres. Right? We just need more stuff. Right? There weren't a lot of Catholic names among all the authors that I've been listing tonight, and we could certainly use more. Let me close by once more returning to Dante and Matilda. Children's literature is about the adventure into the golden world in which innocence is fought for and achieved. Children's literature, at its best, is an attempt to return to or recreate the terrestrial paradise. And for the Catholic literary mind, this is the ultimate venture into reality and the recipe for a truly happy ever after. Thank you so much for your attention.
We are now going to open the floor if anyone has any questions for Mr. McInerny.
Of course, I have to do a little marketing here. You see the website for my series there, kingdomofpatria.com. I'll also mention, apropos of that, the new digital environments that I was talking about, that in about a week or so I'm going to launch a Kickstarter campaign to enhance my website with a game. I'm now talking with the web design team, Snap360, who designed the Kingdom of Patria site. They're helping me work through the design of a game. My illustrator, Ted Schlenderfritz, is primed and ready to provide a lot more illustrations for the site. It's be kind of like a poor man's Pottermore in that there will be clickable maps, clickable illustrations, backstory, audio elements. So that's kind of my next big venture in this world. if you're interested in that, maybe you'll want to give me your name and email address. I'll have a sign-up sheet here if you're interested in that. But I'm happy to talk about any aspect of my remarks tonight.
Are there any questions?
Danny, I was utterly convinced about what you were saying. A couple of questions. It seemed to me you were certainly right that the celestial place needn't be fantasy-like. I mean,
Yeah,
it's.
right.
I mean, and you're certainly right too that the connection between children's literature and grown-up literature has got to be very close. And a couple of comments about that. I don't know of anybody who reads books. I'm an old man now, 70 years old. There's still children's books. There's not a year goes by that I don't read Captains Courageous and Kidnapped. I mean, it's the two.
Right.
And I don't know of anybody who reads books who doesn't still return to. I even read this summer, since you made a confession, I will too, the first book in the Anne of Green Gables series again for probably the 30th time.
Yep.
But there's another thing. Don't you think in the Victorian period there was a sense in which the spirit of children's literature you talked about got deliberately sort of transferred, I don't know the quite right critical language here, into adult fiction. And it's always seemed to me that Dickens, especially, as it were, writes 800-page children's books for adults. I mean, it takes something like Our Mutual Friend. I mean, you take almost any of them. And it's as though children's literature kind of turned back and sort of transformed adult literature in a certain sort of way. And that seems to me to be another part of the theme.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dickens, his collected works are what you want to reference for an adult response to modernity and industrialization in 19th century England. And I think you're seeing it's the same reaction. He wants to create what's ultimately going to be a comic world. So we have very broad comic characters. We have heightened melodrama. It all comes out right pretty much in the end, except for David Copperfield maybe. But it all comes out. No, David Copperfield's good. Great Expectations, no. But it all comes out pretty well in the end. I think that it's that same, I don't know if you want to call it a romantic impulse, but the sense in which we have to find that innocence in this world. I think that's what Chesterton appreciated in Dickens so much, something like that. Chesterton would have the better words to describe it, of course, but it was that impulse, what's really a very human impulse. I don't want to critique that romantic impulse. It has some problems with it, but it had a lot of humanity in it, too. It was trying to recapture elements of our humanity that were being lost in enlightened modernity. And children's literature is a fruit of that. Dickens is another. I think it was all happening simultaneously. Yeah, that's good. I'll make another confession. I was reading Anne of Green Gables as a graduate student in philosophy. I needed to get on another track, and it was just that was a golden world I was very happy to enter into after reading Husserl for several hours.
Thank you, Dan. Found that very interesting and inspiring. I had a question about your use of the word innocence as opposed to redemption. And if there was a deliberate reason you use that, and how that might interface with what you were talking about, the trend in especially young adult literature to just leave people in darkness in the experience of suffering or sin or evil, and not to come out on the other side with what we would call redemption.
Right. I think we could use that word redemption more or less as a synonym for innocence, as I was talking about it. I guess I took my cue from how the writers of that period in the 19th, early 20th century would have described what they were doing. I don't know if they would have used redemption, but I think they would have been very comfortable with saying, there's the innocence of the child that we're trying to protect, celebrate, and nurture in these adventures that we're telling. But I think the phenomenon is the same. and it goes well with what I was saying, the child doesn't enter the golden world of the narrative with innocence intact and then has some adventure in which the innocence is never touched. That's a recipe for a very boring story. The child may have a certain innate innocence, but there's a lot of maturity that needs to go on. And often enough, that narrative arc is going to be one of that protagonist's redemption, or the redemption of the loved ones, or the redemption of the whole world if it's a big epic kind of story, saving the person or the community or the world from threats. That's one way of describing this phenomenon as well. You can see that's, when you put it that way, that's not peculiar at all to children's literature. That's why I really want to emphasize children's and adult. It's of a piece, really. It's the same narrative of redemption, forging innocence. That's a good way of putting it, though. Thank you. Question in the way back. This better be good, Mary Liz.
Yeah, sorry, I'm all the way on the far side of the room. Okay, so I had a question. At the beginning, you mentioned how children's literature brings us to reality rather than dragging us away.
Yeah.
And you've already spoken some of that with your innocence. But I've encountered several angry rants against children's literature that involves anthropomorphized animals and even machines like Thomas the Tank Engine or Beatrix Potter, The Wind in the Willows, Redwall, all these, you made reference to several things.
Did you see that Thomas the Tank Engine rant on Facebook this week? Is that what you're referring to? Or is that?
That was one, but I've seen several over, especially the last several months, especially having to do with animals.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you would answer that, especially in light of you were saying it brings us to reality rather than taking
Right.
us away from it.
Right. I would really urge you to, I'm sure you have, but I think the key text here again is Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, but also Brad Bertzer's, in the book I mentioned, his book on Tolkien treats what I think is your question very well, and that is, do fantasy elements, talking animals, other worlds, magical powers, whatever, do fantasy elements take us away from reality or to reality? They can be handled well or badly, of course, but I agree with Tolkien and many others, Lewis and others, that those elements can be used as a way to portray in a very heightened, compelling sense the kind of moral transformation we've been talking about. That's the point of a talking animal or magical powers. If an author doesn't perceive that that's the point, then you might run into some problems. But I don't take those fantasy elements as in and of themselves problematic. I remember years ago sitting with some academics around a table, and we were talking about the Harry Potter series, and someone was saying, well, all fantasy literature like that is bad. It just keeps kids numb, to what is really happening in the world, and they need to get to reality. I think someone like Tolkien would argue very vociferously against that. Good fantasy literature, at least, is going to take us into the reality. The secondary world is not hermetically sealed from the primary world. It can be a portal to it. How that happens, I think you'd have to get into the real literary details of a certain, fantasy effect. But in general, I think it can be done. Thank you for that.
Dan, you talked a good deal about the kind of turn to the dark side of contemporary children's literature and the problems of that. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about, and maybe I missed it, but if you had thoughts about the sanitizing of old, good children's literature. of the features, I mean, especially fairy tales and so on and so on.
Oh, yeah, right.
Of the features that are sort of the things that the children fought against.
Yes, right,
And the
right.
dangers and the horrors and the being baked in a pie. And
Right.
so on and so on.
Right,
Hansel and Gretel, which is a nice, kind of sugary tale now.
Yeah, that's right.
And no pun intended on the sugar.
Right.
And what your thought is about the effect of that sanitizing of these children's stories, not the dark side stories, but the light side stories, and what your view would be on which is worse, the turn to the dark side stories,
Right.
or the sanitizing of the dark features of the good children's literature.
Yeah. What examples of the turn to the dark side story? You thinking of the young adult stuff I was mentioning? Yeah.
Which is a bit different in terms of age.
Yeah. Right. Right. I think people, have often remarked that like Grimm's fairy tales are grim, and we have sanitized them in a way, and aren't they very dark? And I think it is a shame when those get sanitized. I don't know what the historical process was. I don't know if they got Frenchified. I don't know if that's the argument that Tolkien makes on fairy stories, but he does rail against French versions of fairy tales. Of course, his taste was for the more rugged northern mythology. Because what you're sanitizing there is the real encounter with evil, which is the engine of the moral transformation that you want. And Tolkien, for example, hated fairy tales reduced to little, what we think of as fairies, these little winged creatures that live in the rose garden. It had nothing to do with size, and they encountered, real difficulties. So I abhor that, certainly. Comparing which is worse, both being bad, of course, I guess I would say that the sanitized fairy tales can be banal, harmful to an extent, but I think folks who are really misunderstanding the nature of good and evil in a more substantial way, say in the young adult stuff, I would think that would be a more dangerous error if I had to compare. That's an interesting point. Yeah, sure.
I wonder, and it just might be a kind of social psychological speculation, the extent to which the popularity of the dark side in the young adult literature is itself a product of the sanitization of the fairy stories.
Interesting. I don't know, but you wonder if the world is reduced to a kind of niceness and prettiness, if that leaves one vulnerable, at least to not understanding the nature of moral good and evil. I could see there's being some connection there. I don't know how to trace, again, the history, but I wouldn't be surprised to find one. Absolutely, yeah. I think there were a couple hands down here. Or Angela, please, up there.
I'm struck by the tension in the phrase, the fight for innocence. And to my ear, it sounds a little bit like a fight for peace or something like that. Could you talk a little bit about why you use that rather than something like struggle?
Well, I guess I mean the same thing as struggle. You can't have peace without war. There's no peace without struggle, no peace without a fight of some sort. Doesn't have to be bombing Syria, but there has to be some sort of struggle, if only interior, if there's going to be peace. And so I guess I'm thinking of that I guess I just really wanted to underscore, I think I said more than once, that I don't want to perceive children's literature as though on page 1 you have the innocent child. In a sense you do. I mean, at the beginning of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, you have a pretty good kid. But he's nothing to what he becomes by the end of book 7. Because I would argue, John's going to argue, I think in part next week, he grows in virtue. He's really challenged by real forces of evil. And he has to become something that he wasn't. What he becomes, though, I want to describe as innocence, because that's moral purity. That's what he's meant to be in the end. And that kind of achievement doesn't come without a fight, I guess. Does that make some sense? Did I hit your point?
No, that's
No, try me. I'm sorry if I missed it. Try me again. Okay, but thank you for that question. I wanna get it right.
When I saw the title, Imagination and Innocence, I immediately thought of my favorite children's book, which is The Little Prince.
Yeah.
That's like what it's all about. But I was also curious when you mentioned the tendency in children's literature to have to be in the comic tradition of like happy endings and stuff.
Yeah.
And I feel like The Little Prince is tragic because he dies, and it's so
Yeah.
sad. And I'm thinking of like Bridge to Terabithia too. I mean, that's really sad, and it feels tragic. And so
Is
how
sadness
does that,
always, is a sad ending, even a death, always tragic? I mean, I asked that to the, it's a big question. No, but I guess that's what I would want to ask of both those books. I mean, a sadness, tragedy is not just that a death happens at the end. If there's something other,
just like when I was a little kid, that really broke me up.
broke you up.
Yeah.
Right,
And
right.
just how does that factor into the
Yeah.
genres?
Well, again, you can have, again, a death or a sadness at the end of a tale doesn't mean that we don't have positive resolution, reconciliation. I mean, Harry Potter series kind of cheats on this because we get death and, not cheats, but it gets the best of both worlds in that we have both death and resurrection. So we got a very clear, very Christian kind of comic trajectory there. I don't know, we'd have to go deep into the Little Prince. Maybe you want to talk about that. Like, what is it about that ending that could be construed as tragic?
Just how the protagonist. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about it more, and
Yeah, I can't think of an example of a children's story that I would say is a tragedy, either in sort of the ancient Greek sense. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm not saying The Little Prince isn't, but I can't think of one that immediately strikes me as a tragedy like Oedipus Rex or even Hamlet or King Lear, where you have a sense of doom, where the world seems to be set against the character, or that in the Shakespearean sense you've got a tragic flaw on the part of the character that kind of dooms him. That's a really hard sort of sadness. Maybe there are children's books like that. I don't know.
no, I think you're right. Like, at least in The Little Prince, like it is a very like redemptive kind of like optimistic, but still really sad.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a challenging point.
Thank you for
Catherine.
this great talk. I have been learning quite a lot about Maria Montessori this summer,
Yeah.
and I'm just sort of Montessorifying my world a little bit. But
Just doing whatever you want, basically.
Right. Well, in one of her books, she talks about that. It's back to this dressed animal thing of like, when do you introduce fantasy to a child? Because she would say, actually, you don't do it until they're 6. You wait until about the age of reason to even introduce that element at all. Like, give them just reality up until they can start to actually grapple with differences in reality, and that's.
You
rocking my world.
meaning no talking animal books?
Yeah, like even that, I think. She would, like, so right now my 4-year-old is just obsessed with anything that's only real. Like, so like you, as a kid, he just wants to learn about amphibians. So I can't
Yeah,
even.
right.
So I'm getting him these eyewitness books
Yeah.
that have like these little chunks of totally above his head
Oh, yeah, I know what you
commentary.
mean. Yeah, right,
But he
right.
just is obsessed with them. And he wants
Right.
he kind of makes up stories about the pictures
Uh-oh.
of like
Yeah.
a snake eating an entire rabbit.
Right.
Um,
Right. Does the snake talk before he eats
Yeah,
the
well,
rabbit?
so
Yeah.
he's sort of adding that element, but I think Maria Montessori would argue that, like, it's better to just give them the reality and let their own imagination do something with it rather than give them fantasy to begin with. So I'm just wondering
I don't
what
know.
you
I
think
mean,
about that.
I'm no child psychologist. I don't know what the significance is in the age of 6 that makes.
It's just her age of reason, like 6 or 7.
Oh, okay.
You know, like theologically speaking.
Yeah.
Too.
I don't know. There's nothing knowing just and only that would make me think that I would need to sign on to that. Again, I don't think that a talking animal picture book, even a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old is going to get that animals don't talk. That's the fun of it. They know this is anthropomorphism, even though they don't know the word. They know this has, I think they have some sense that this has a connection to real life. Mm-hmm. We're playing here, at very least. So without knowing more, maybe there's psychological intricacies there I know nothing about.
Yeah,
But knowing just and only that, I'm not sure I agree with it.
Okay.
I think scads of parents have introduced all sorts of fantasy literature very early in their. What have we missed in doing that?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe there is something. I just don't know. Yes, sir.
I was wondering a little bit about the distinctions between a coming-of-age story and the Golden World stories that you're talking about, because it seems like in both instances you have the main character coming out with a different kind of character and maturity than they had going into it.
Sure, yeah. Again, a coming-of-age story doesn't make a distinction between a fantasy story and a non-fantasy story. You find that narrative arc in both kinds of children's book, and you find it in adult books, because that kind of story, that kind of template is essential to literature wherever we find it. Not that every story is a coming of age, but it's one of the basic patterns that we read. So again, you can go into a secondary world, and I keep using Harry Potter, but even Peter Pan in its own way. You go into the secondary world, and you can have a coming-of-age story, but you can have a coming-of-age story in Johnny Tremaine, which is historical fiction. And for that matter, you can have a coming-of-age story in nonfiction for kids. So that narrative pattern is going to be found everywhere. Does that hit your thought, or?
Well, how does it differ substantially from the Golden World idea that you're exploring more in specifically children's literature?
How does what differ? The coming of age
Yes.
theme? Well, it's one. The Golden World idea sort of can be found in many different. Can be found played out in many different kinds of narrative patterns.
Okay.
Right? Not just the coming of age story, but in the fall and redemption tale, or whatever. I mean, there are basic sort of narrative arcs that we find throughout literature. In most children's literature, if not all children's literature, those basic narrative patterns get played out by the character entering some kind of what I'm calling golden world, right? So in a coming-of-age story, Johnny Tremaine has to work out his destiny in colonial-era Boston, right? It has to be worked out by Harry Potter at Hogwarts. It has to be worked out by Anne of Green Gables in Avonlea. All of those coming-of-age stories in their own way. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you for joining us this evening for this presentation, and we hope to see you next week as we continue the series with Professor O'Callahan's discussion of the Harry Potter series. If you're interested in learning more about these events and the Center for Ethics and Culture, make sure to sign the sheet that's going around the room. Let us thank Daniel McInerny once again for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And again, And again, always be closing. If you want to be on the Trojan Tub Entertainment email list, there's a sheet right here. But thank you so much for attending and for your questions.